Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our very first episode of Strictly History. This is a podcast that we will be talking about movies which are set in historical events, or talking about historical characters and seeing whether or not these movies or even TV shows that got right, that got wrong, that used myths to perpetuate dramatizations of certain scenes. I'm Katie.
I'm Allison.
And today we'll be talking about the Titanic. Now, the Titanic sank in April 15th, 1912. So this year, it's the 110th anniversary.
Sounds right.
Of the sinking. It turned 100 in 2012. I was very happy about that since I was working on a project on my undergrad for it. But, so the movie The Titanic by James Cameron in 1997 was, for the most part, historically accurate to some extent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, the romance between Jack and Rose is not historically accurate at all.
Who's to say, though?
It's not historically accurate, Lou.
How do you know? How do you know there wasn't a romance on the ship?
Well, there may have been a romance of the ship, but it wouldn't be between first class and third class because the ship was separated between classes. Steerage, or third class, was well within the bowels of the ship. And first class was, of course, on the upper decks, which also gave them an advantage to getting to the lifeboats first before steerage passengers could even attempt to go up on deck.
Yeah. The problem was that the classes were separated by the ship's policy, in that to comply with U.S. immigration law, that would say that third-class immigrants needed to depart the ship at Ellis Island in order to go through health screenings. Unless the ship did not have third class, they needed to separate the classes.
Right, which comes into question the barricades.
Yeah.
So in the movie, when the ship is sinking, you see that the barricades are being manned by stewards who are keeping the barricades locked, who are keeping people down below. This wasn't the case at all. The barricades were simply just closed because of the immigration policy and because it was, again, a way to separate passengers on the ship from in their classes. And people who are so ingrained in society of the time, we're talking 1912, we're talking early 20th century, the class system is certainly still very much prevalent in this time period. So anyone who came across a closed barrier, regardless of whether or not the ship was actually sinking, would have stayed and waited for a steward or a stewardess to come and open the barricade. There certainly wasn't any actual thought to trying to save yourself.
Yeah. I did notice, watching the film, because they show the barricades pretty often, I think maybe 3 separate times.
Yeah.
And it is interesting because what I I saw in a few places that the barricades were not that high.
Yep.
They were about waist level.
Yep.
So if you wanted to get over it, you could.
You could hop the fence.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in the case where, towards the end of the film, where they're trying to pass the barricade, and the water's high, so then they could swim over it. They wouldn't have been trapped by it the way it's portrayed in the film.
Right. Again, dramatizing an event just to make the scene more intense or more anxiety inducing as opposed to actually showing what was going on.
Yeah, that was the thought I got. It certainly ups the intensity of the moment, but it wouldn't have happened that way.
No. And then we come to another point of the lifeboats. Were there enough lifeboats on deck? Were there more than enough lifeboats on deck and just not enough for the extra 1,000 people that the Titanic had ended up taking on in steerage, that there wasn't enough anyway? I think historians and writers have different variations of like the lifeboat regulation. So I've heard on several different times, and I've read several different times, that the lifeboats, there was actually enough lifeboats per tonnage of the ship. They didn't necessarily put in lifeboats for the amount of people, but for the tonnage of the ship. And it comes to, I think, the fact that it's a practice that's always worked, that's always come through, that's always so it's like this, I don't know how I would describe it. It's like this complacency.
Yeah.
That it's, the tonnage of the ship dictates how many lifeboats are on.
Yeah, I think there was also this expectation at the time that if the ship sank, there would be enough time for the lifeboats to leave and come back and bring more passengers away from the ship.
Right.
Because before this, when ships sank, like there was one instance, I think 1907, when the Republic sank, they had more than enough time to evacuate everyone.
Right.
And the only deaths were during the actual collision between the two ships. So I think that was something that, they thought would work out. They didn't question that they wouldn't have enough time.
Right. Again, complacency.
Yeah.
Complacency. And I would also say, too, though, that the regulation law hadn't been updated for the fact that Titanic and her sister ships, Olympic and Gigantic, which was then renamed the Britannic during World War I, I should say, excuse me, they were far larger than any steamliner that had been built to the day. And so they had far more, I don't remember the exact numbers of the tonnage of Titanic, but it wouldn't adequately put enough lifeboats on the ship. Yeah. So by regulation standards of the time, they had enough lifeboats. But then no one accounted for the fact that there was also a coal strike going on. And so when Titanic took passengers from ships, from other steamers that couldn't leave because of the coal strike, they added more passengers onto the ship. Again, mostly steerage passengers, because that's how steamliners at the time made the most money, was from foreign immigrants going to America. So they took on more passengers, and thus making not enough lifeboats for passengers. And I don't know if I explained, like if I adequately...
No, I think you did.
Okay. But that's... so that's the story I'm going with, the accounts that I'm going with, that there was enough lifeboats. There were just far more people. And during the sinking, none of the officers filled the lifeboats to capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was like, I believe it was lifeboat number 7 only left with like 10 people when it could fit like 65. I mean, they weren't adequately being full.
Yeah, and they did touch on that in the movie. They had Thomas Andrews go up on the deck, and I think he was speaking to Lightoller.
Yeah.
And he said, why aren't the lifeboats being filled to capacity?
And Lightoller said, well, they weren't sure of the weight, and they feared that the boat would buckle. And Andrews' response is that they were tested with 65 men from Belfast.
Yeah.
And it would have been... Now, I don't want to assume, and I don't want to generalize either, but if the lifeboats were tested, I'm assuming that they were using men who actually worked on the shipyard. So you're talking about men who are bulkier, have a more muscular frame. So if they were tested with that weight of 65 men, then the boat was not going to buckle with more people on the boats.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And I guess it's hard in those times to maybe think rationally like that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, at that point in the movie, you can tell Lightoller is panicking,
Yeah.
is scared, is wanting to get as much, not wanting to get as much people off the boat, but wanting to get the lifeboats cleared out as fast as possible, and then, in some aspects, save himself.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
I think also it seemed like there was a problem initially getting people on the lifeboats
Oh, yeah.
because people didn't think the situation was that dire. There were people who really thought that they would be back in the morning, that this was just an overreaction to the situation.
Yep.
So I would assume at least for the initial lifeboats going out before it became apparent the ship was sinking,
Yeah.
they probably also didn't have people who wanted to get on.
Oh,
And that was a problem.
That was a very real thing. Because the ship is so large that depending upon where you were on the ship when the Titanic hit the iceberg, you didn't feel anything. Most people have said that they had felt just a shudder and they didn't know what was going on. And then you had people who didn't feel anything at all. So that, with the culmination of a general alarm not going out because they didn't want to cause a panic, which I think is really short-sighted, because if people have that information, then you've got people who are more eager to get off of the ship. I think also, too, was the fact that Titanic was called the unsinkable ship. And in my research many years ago, I actually came across something, and I remember this very distinctly when I was going through undergrad and I was doing research for my project that I was doing on the Titanic, that it wasn't necessarily like White Star Line saying that Titanic was unsinkable. It was an advertisement that had gone out in like a newspaper at the time, or like a magazine at the time, though you wouldn't really necessarily call it a magazine.
Yeah.
That called the ship unsinkable because of its size, because of its grandeur, because of the fact that it had new technology for watertight compartments. The only problem is that the bulkheads didn't go all the way up to E deck or D deck high enough where if the water continued to fill, it wouldn't spill over into the other compartments, which is what happened. And the ship was able to float still with three to four.
Yeah, I think it was three.
Three. Watertight compartments full. But if it got to the fourth, then it wasn't going to be able to float anymore. And that's essentially what happened. So it's this, like I said before, from the movie's perspective, James Cameron got the sinking fairly historically accurate with how the iceberg hit the ship, with how the ship sank, although he filmed it where it was vertically up like this. That's no. That's not what happened because of how the ship was hit and where the ship was hit. It wouldn't have gone vertically up. It would have rolled, essentially. It would have listed to the side and then rolled down under. Yeah, the stern of the ship may have looked like it did rise vertically up, but because it was still attached to the keel, which was like the double bottom of the ship, ironically to prevent something like this from happening, but it hadn't been built all the way up to like the water line, which is why when the iceberg hit, it was devastation.
Yeah. I would say to his credit, he is the most accurate out of a lot of the media film portrayals of the sinking.
Well, I mean, like in 1958, there was a Titanic movie made called A Night to Remember, and it was based off of a book by Walter Lord, who was, I think, a survivor, a witness to this.
Yeah, I think he was a survivor.
To the sinking. And what the director did in that movie, he didn't even show the ship breaking apart. He showed the ship going down in one piece, which is really unrealistic because of all that weight and all of that strain of the ship going down. It's going to, its structural integrity is not going to hold out.
Yeah, I found that very interesting that for a long time, the main theory, and it wasn't really even a theory, just what was accepted about the sinking, was
Right.
that the ship went down in one piece, even though the majority of the survivors said that that's not what happened.
Right.
The most prevailing idea was that it did.
Right.
And it's likely because people like Lightoller, who did survive, you know, he's a high-ranking officer. I think he was the second officer. He
Yeah.
said that it went down in one piece.
Right.
So
And
you would
it's-
assume he would be right.
Right, and it's like of the time as well. If you get, because like I know our modern sensibilities are like gonna say, well, that's ridiculous. You know, why would people think this way and all this other stuff? But it's like you really can't think in terms of our 21st century thinking. You really got to think how people would act in the 20th century, especially the early 20th century. So you're looking at the Edwardian period. You're looking at like, because we're essentially at this point at the height of British Empire, and you only really see the decline of like the British Empire of the Edwardian period at the start of World War One. Here in this time period, people are very proud of Britain, very proud of the fact that they're like they're at this point the rulers of half the world at this point. And to think that a British ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, that went down, broke apart. It's not something that anyone would think would happen.
Yeah. I feel like also, unless you saw it happen or you were able to see the wreckage after, it's hard to imagine
Right.
that it would look like that.
Right.
And probably also too horrifying to imagine.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, it makes sense that people just trusted
Oh, absolutely.
higher-ranking officers, and I think it might have been Lord
Yeah.
who also said that it went down in one piece.
Right. Yeah.
So like a trusted author as well.
Right, and
you know.
you also have people who testified during the inquiries, both the United States and Great Britain, after the sinking, and you have their testimony saying you got, like, I don't want to say the majority of people, but you got a good number of people also saying that the ship went down in one piece.
Yeah.
And you got another group of people that's saying that, well, no, it split in half, or, you know, so it's, who do you listen to?
Yeah.
Who do you follow as, you know, experts as you were of what happened? And notoriously, eyewitness accounts are not accurate in any way. So I think it's also easier to say, well, no, because the ship's a British ship, then the ship sank as one and went down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, from what I saw, it seemed like there was like less than 10 people who said it went down in one piece.
Yeah.
A lot of people who said they didn't know
Yep.
what they thought happened. You know, it was dark.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it was just a chaotic situation where you might not really be aware of what's
Yeah.
happening around you, or you just don't really remember.
Right.
And then around like 50 people who said it went down in two pieces, and some of them were pretty accurate to what it seems like happened.
Yeah.
And those would be from people who I think were closer to the ship when it went down.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But then, of course, you've got people in power, especially in Great Britain. Like you had Lord Mersey, who was heading the inquiry into the sinking, and he doesn't want to humiliate the board of directors of White Star. He doesn't want to humiliate the I can't remember the regulation, the name of the shipping regulators who made the regulations. Can't remember their name. But so he essentially didn't blame White Star. He didn't blame the regulations of the time. What he did was he blamed the captain of the Californian, who was supposedly much closer to the Titanic, who had stopped because of ice fields, who ignored like the Morse code lamp that had been who the radio was off on the Californian. He only signaled with the Morse code lamp, which no one was really paying attention to. They didn't think it was Titanic because, again, it's supposedly an unsinkable ship.
Yeah.
So he was founded as being negligent in not investigating further and not. So it became widely known that the captain of the Californian had been the cause of the loss of life, even though we now know that it's a culmination of a whole bunch of things. I mean, even the weather is was to blame for that, because you had a calm. There was no waves being generated to crash against the iceberg. It was so cold outside, like the temperature outside as opposed to the temperature of the ocean was so cold that we had that they lost the horizon. You couldn't see the horizon. All you saw was stars. So you had this like effect of a mirage like you would in the desert, which makes sense, because if you have extreme hot and you see a mirage in the desert, you're more than likely going to have the same effect in extreme cold. So that was another factor. And then, of course, you had the fact that the captain, Edward Smith, who went down with this ship, John Edward Smith is the captain's name. Yeah. Well, no, Edward J. Smith. I should know these things. But I messed up. Anyway, so he is also the cause of the sinking, because he's a seasoned captain. He was called the millionaire captain because every millionaire from Great Britain to America had wanted to sail with him, because he was an experienced captain. He had many years in the service. This was actually going to be, after this maiden voyage, he was going to retire from being a sea captain. And he had upped Titanic's speed. He didn't slow down after warning after warning. He had gotten like at least 5 to 10 different warnings of ice during the entire voyage. And especially during that day, during Sunday. She sank on Sunday morning, so it must have been Saturday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. He got at least 5 other ice warnings that day and didn't experience, like how we always say, hindsight's 20/20. And his experience is overshadowing the fact that, he knows that he should take these warnings seriously.
Yeah. It seemed like, from what I read, that there was this idea that, and I don't think it was an official thing, but maybe just a learned experience, that sometimes they would go fast through ice fields just to get out of it faster.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like you said, hindsight's 20/20. They probably wouldn't have done that if they knew what was going to happen.
Right.
But that was his experience.
Yeah. I also saw something where this particular iceberg, after it broke off Greenland, like the ice shelf in Greenland or in Newfoundland, Canada, it actually followed the route that icebergs would normally follow, and like by the time they got to the sea, it was supposed to have melted and they wouldn't have an issue anyway.
Oh.
This iceberg, because of the cold temperatures, because of its massive size, because of its whatever, it didn't melt by the time it got to the ocean, and it actually traveled further south. than normal. So, I mean, Captain Smith had also changed course to travel more south than north, like normal, clearly thinking that he was going to miss this iceberg or miss any icebergs or ice flows. But it ended up traveling more southern than initially anticipated as well. I also want to say, too, that a lot of thought process, a lot of survivors who were in first class had said that, J. Bruce Ismay, the owner of Titanic, White Star Line, had said that, had boasted about Titanic's speed and had said that, disregarded the ice warnings as well, and had told Jay. I know that there's a line in Titanic that Bruce Ismay has to Captain Smith, that boiler 3 hadn't been lit, and and Captain Smith was saying how well, we don't really need the speed,
Yeah.
And then Bruce Ismay is well, just think of the headlines when we reach New York on Monday morning or something like that. And so they light the third boiler. It's not shown in the movie, but the speed definitely goes faster, and so there's a lot of speculation on that. But when you think about it, once you're on a ship, you're at the hands of the captain. It's the captain's duty to make sure that you get to your destination safely. So even though you had not only Bruce Ismay, but you had John Jacob Astor and his wife Madeline, you had Guggenheim, you had you have these big named people of the time, and they could easily tell the captain, well, why don't you go faster? Why do you bother with ice warnings? And he would obviously disregard such things because it's his ship. You're in his command. He has command of the ship. It wouldn't have mattered whether or not a passenger of first class or even John Bruce Ismay would have said, well, let's go faster to make better headlines. And then after the sinking, Captain Smith tells Bruce Ismay, after Bruce Ismay says, well, the ship can't sink, he says, well, now I believe you'll get your headline, Mr. Ismay. So again, you have this perpetual thought process that for some reason the captain would not have the last say of how fast you would go, how slow you would go, whether or not you would make headlines, So it's interesting that some people would vilify Ismay into thinking that he had some sway over the captain, which in my mind doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah, I definitely found that interesting. And that seems like it's not even particular to this movie.
Right.
That since the ship sank, he's been vilified. And I was reading through the depositions that some of the survivors gave before the Senate.
Yeah.
And that was a big line of questioning, was people who spoke with Ismay, what did he say about the ship's speed? Did he say that they were going to try to get into port early?
Yeah.
And he definitely spoke about that, but it seemed unclear whether or not he was just reporting something that he was told.
Right.
As opposed to something that he was making happen,
Right. Right. So it's it's a little silly to think that he would have any sway over the captain, the captain would think that, and anyone would think that the captain would actually listen to somebody who's not in command of the ship, but a passenger. I mean, he may have command over the company and how the ship is built and, what's put on the ship. But once he's on the ship as a passenger, he's a passenger.
Yeah.
So I found that interesting as well, that was a big thing. And it was almost like people not wanting to put some of the blame of it, of the ship's management or of its sinking on the captain, when the captain is just as responsible. Also, what I thought was interesting as well is that Light Howler See, so like the certain officers would either adhere or not adhere to women and children only.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, it wasn't first, it was only. So, I know that Lighthauler stuck to that. He was only putting women and children on the lifeboats, whereas Murdoch and other sailors on like the other side of the ship was also letting men on lifeboats as well. So that's not so much of a myth that was perpetuated. It actually happened.
Yeah. I found it interesting, though, because I felt like in the film, when they address that, it seems like they're implying it's like Murdoch shouldn't have been doing that. He shouldn't have been letting men.
Yeah. Like in the movie, in Titanic, James Cameron's Titanic, you saw Murdoch letting men and women on the boats, and then you had the character Cal come up to Murdoch and give him money as though like to bribe him to put him on the lifeboat to ensure his space. And it's like, but now you're vilifying Murdoch for no reason. Like there's no need for that because that's what he was doing.
Yeah.
And with the problem, but then you have an equally but then you have another problem on Lighthauler's side because you had women who didn't want to leave their husbands behind. I mean, at first it was, oh no, I don't want to get on the boat. This is an unsinkable ship. Why are we even, wanting to leave the boat? Like, this is ridiculous. But once the situation got more real, more dire, you had women not wanting to leave their husbands.
Yeah. Like,
at all. I think Isidore Strauss's wife, again, and I can't remember her name, which Ida. Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ida had told her husband, because her husband was trying to get her onto a lifeboat, had told her husband that, I started this life with you. I'm going to end this life with you. So, I mean, it's really very powerful things that, they don't want, like, they don't want to leave each other. So it's like almost one of those things where it's like, I don't know how I would react if I was in that situation, if I would want to stay and potentially die of exposure and or get on the lifeboat and see if I could even, you could still potentially die of exposure on the lifeboat, which was dangerous equally since they were in the North Atlantic. So, I mean, but again, going back to Lighthauler and his definitive response of just women and children only, again, perpetuates the problems of, not having enough women and children on the lifeboats and thus lowering lifeboats that were, that were like half full or even only 3/4 full.
And there were times that, in that particular area, there would be no more women and children to get on the lifeboat.
Right.
So in Murdoch's case, then he would let men on.
Yep.
Because, the lifeboat's not full or as full as they were going to let it be, and there's no one else for that policy to get on.
Right.
So you'll let men on. But like you said, not everyone did that. Mm-hmm. But that's why some men were able to get on the lifeboats.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also want to bring up as well the issue of how, again, we're going back to like how the barricades were locked but not really locked. With steerage, you didn't have steerage passengers coming up the decks to get on as well. You had mostly first class and second class passengers, of which I'd like to make a note of. For whatever reason, second class passengers and crew members are not written about as much as steerage passengers and first class passengers.
Yeah.
I just want to make that note.
I guess it doesn't make the story as interesting.
Or exciting, which I think is really ridiculous. Anyway, the ship itself was such a maze of hallways and like and doors. And an equal problem was that there was no translation of directions in other languages in order to help people get out of the inner workings of the ship in order to make it up onto deck in time for the lifeboats. It wasn't that they were preventing those people from getting to the lifeboats. It was just Titanic itself was such a maze that if you didn't know where you were going, you could easily get lost in the ship.
Yeah, and if English is your second language, you might not be able to read any signs that could help you.
Right.
And like you said, like the third class passengers weren't able to go to the first and second class areas where the lifeboats were.
Right.
So they wouldn't have had that experience throughout, the voyage to know, like, where they could go, where they were supposed to go.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, what James Cameron does well, but honestly, if you're not paying attention to the scene, you're going to miss it, kind of a thing, because you're focused on what Jack and Rose is doing, trying to get out of the steerage. But there is a couple, and they look like they're a foreign family whose English is not a second language, and he's got a translator book in his hand, and he's staring at a sign that I think it says, like, E-deck or something like that, and an arrow pointing that direction. He's trying to find the translation in the translation book. So, it's like a throwaway scene almost, but it's like if you're not really looking, you're going to miss it because you're too focused on what Jack and Rose are doing to actually. I mean, I noticed it on like my third or fourth viewing of the film.
Yeah, and things like that do add to the accuracy. I think he did a good job at those small details, including them. And like you said, if you're not paying attention, you won't see it. But if you are, you'll notice it and you'll know what it's trying to indicate.
Right. Absolutely. What I also thought he did well on was that the fact that it took 2 hours and 40 minutes for Titanic to sink. She hit the ship. What am I talking about? She hit the iceberg at 11:40 at night, and then lifeboats were being ready to launch at 12 a.m. So there was a whole 20 minutes of trying to figure out what was going on and how severe the damage was before lifeboats even started being not loaded with passengers, but being ready to be lowered down into the sea. And the ship sinks fully at 2:20 a.m. with people still on board, whether they were up on the decks at this point or still in the bowels of the ship, and then you had people in the water. I think it was like 1,500 people went down with Titanic, and only like 756 survived the sinking.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too that I think he portrayed very well that initially, like when people didn't want to get on the lifeboats yet, the way people were very casual about it. There was no sense of urgency. I think there is a scene where Thomas Andrews is walking through the crowd of people, and he's kind of, I don't know what the word for it would be, not amazed, but shocked that no one is trying to get off the ship right now.
Right. I know that he gets on the deck outside and asks one of the officers, why isn't anyone outside ready? And the officer says, they're all inside. It's too cold and noisy for the passengers, for them. And we're talking first-class passengers. And first-class passengers, again, are these millionaire, these wealthy, well-to-do people. Some of them are aristocrats who are arrogant and entitled, have entitled attitudes, and are, think that, how they view the world is their way of viewing it. And so you can tell them to do something, but they're not going to necessarily do it in a timely fashion unless you tell them how dire the situation is. And that's what I think happens in the scene when he's at the main stairwell and Rose goes up to Mr. Andrews because she can see that he's panicked somewhat, and she asks him what's going on, please don't lie to me. And he tells her, but he doesn't want to, but he also tells her that he doesn't want to start a panic, that he just tells her, to get on the lifeboat. And, he says, you remember what I told you about the lifeboats. There aren't enough for everyone. And then, of course, Cal, being the arrogant a-hole that he is, says, only the better half. And that's not only stating to himself, but also to first-class passengers.
Yeah.
Because, again, it's only highlighting the fact that classes are very much separate and that they don't mingle and that they're better than the lowers, as it were. So, Lou, to your question before, when this podcast started, that's why Jack and Rose's romance is utterly unrealistic and completely historically inaccurate.
Yeah. I mean, well, they wouldn't have met.
Right.
They wouldn't have been able to go to the same parts of the ships.
Right.
There were, the barriers. And then there would have been crew standing at these barriers, preventing you from passing if you could pass.
Yep.
And the social conventions would have been too strong.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. I think they did a good job about discussing all that, though, and how he was able to get through the stuff. He got through the stuff because of her. So.
Well, that's
you guys even just said when I was walking in just now, they kind of did what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
The rich people.
Yeah.
So if a rich person wanted some lower third tier person to have dinner with them, they were going to do it.
That's true, but they didn't. They wouldn't.
How do you know, though?
How do I know?
Yeah.
Because historic research and historic documentation state otherwise. They stuck to their own classes. Because if Rose...
I don't know.
Rose wanting to leave the ship with Jack, she would have been disowned by her mother and all of the comforts of her
It seemed
life.
like Rose in the movie didn't care about all that, though.
That's why her thought process is unrealistic, to say the least. Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, because she would have gone through with the arranged marriage to Cal. She may not have liked it, but she certainly would have still gone through it because it's the only life she knows. And they may
have to agree to disagree on this.
And they may have lived separate lives after their marriage because that happened a lot. Cal would have been allowed to have taken a mistress, but she would not have been allowed to have taken a lover.
mister?
Huh?
A mister?
Yes. A mister. So, but yeah, no, the conventions of the time would have dictated that she would have gone through with the arranged marriage. She would not have had an affair with Jack. So the whole romance aspect of Titanic is not accurate.
Yeah, I mean,
At
the
all.
way I thought about it was just when they first meet on the ship,
Yeah.
they wouldn't have been on the same deck.
No, she wouldn't have ended up on the stern, which is also called the poop deck.
Yeah.
Because that was strictly for third-class passengers. That was their area of the ship.
Yeah. So anything else, you could argue whether or not it would have happened, but they wouldn't have met each other in the first place.
Yeah.
So it couldn't have happened.
All right, answer one question for me.
Okay.
Could he have fit on the door?
Fit on the... Oh, you mean the floating piece of door that... Yeah, he could have fit on the door. I believe Mythbusters had already busted that myth saying that they could have.
Yeah.
But...
So Rose killed Jack.
No, the cold water and the cold weather...
But she could have said, hey, come up on this door.
Well,
with me.
he also resigned himself to the fact that he
Yeah.
wasn't going to get on the door anyway and that he was going to die.
Yeah. Well, they could have tried.
They
more
could
than
have
once.
tried.
Yeah, what a sucker. Give it a shot at least.
Yeah, but quite honestly, they would have died from exposure anyway. the fact that Rose survived is also just a little unrealistic, but I understand that James Cameron needed somebody to tell the story of Titanic.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when they were already under the water on the ship.
Yeah.
So I was like, at that point,
Yeah.
you're already freezing. So unless there's just adrenaline running, and
that's
why
what's
you would be
making
okay.
them moving, like their limbs were able to move and all that other
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah. No, it's the water in the North Atlantic is so cold. I think it's like you have like 5 or 10 minutes before hypothermia sets in and you die from exposure and hypothermia. Also, too, further research has been done about the actual damage to the ship also, and it's not like it's been discovered that it wasn't like a huge gouge.
Yeah.
It's like little thin pinpricks almost along the hull of the ship that damaged it, and which is why I think it took 2 hours and 40 minutes for the ship to sink, because if you look at ships like the Britannic or even the Lusitania, the Britannic hit a sea mine, and the Lusitania was hit by a torpedo, a much bigger opening, a much bigger hole. Both ships sank within like an hour or so, or an hour and a half of being hit. So, and that there's a lot of talk about, whether or not the iron was to blame for the ship splitting. I don't know that we would necessarily know for a fact if it was the iron rivets that helped with that, but I think myself personally that the reason why the ship the damage to the hull of the ship was so great was because the keel didn't go all the way up to the water line where the ship was hit. And I feel like that if that had happened, then the damage wouldn't have been as severe.
Yeah. There's a lot of arguments, like you were saying, about whether or not the ship's manufacturing was a problem.
Yeah.
There's a lot of arguments that for the time it was built the best that it could have been, which isn't even too far from our ships today.
Right.
But it's more just, it was just that situation that they found themselves in was the worst possible one.
Oh, absolutely. It's like Murphy's Law. Whatever did go wrong could go wrong. And also the fact that Murdoch thought it was a good idea to try and turn the ship around the iceberg, whereas if, they just hit it head on, it would have been far less damage, and they could have made it to New York even with the damage that had been caused to the front of the ship, because the damage would have only been done to the bow.
Yeah, which seemed like it was reinforced.
Yes, it was reinforced
to withstand collisions like that.
A good example is her sister ship Olympic, who was racing with the battleship Hawk, and there was a collision and at the front of the ship, and the Olympic didn't sink. It floated. Made it all the way back to port and to make repairs and whatnot. So it's again, hindsight's 2020. But if they just had made a head collision with the iceberg, then they would have been far better off, and they would have been able to. There wouldn't have been such a loss of life.
Yeah.
With the sinking.
Yeah. I mean, it's tragic because they didn't even really have a chance to think about what they should have done. I think it was maybe around 30 seconds after they saw the iceberg to hitting it.
They were so close to the iceberg that the time it took to reverse the engines, or at least to stop, then reverse the engines, and then do an about port and make the turn, it took at least another 30 seconds for that to even happen. So they would have had to have seen the iceberg, much, much sooner. And I think the fact that the weather played a factor, and the fact that the crow's nest didn't have binoculars.
Yeah.
They weren't able to see the iceberg clearly.
I did see an interesting argument, though, that they were saying that having binoculars wouldn't have helped because of how
really?
dark it was
Oh,
and the
yeah.
fact that the sea was calm.
Mm-hmm.
So it would have been difficult to see regardless, but I guess you don't know. You can't prove it.
Right.
But
Right.
I thought it was interesting.
It is interesting. And then when they finally get to when the Carpathia rescues the survivors, the Carpathia, I will point out, was the only ship that answered the call to help, and they were 4 hours away from Titanic. So effectively speaking, Titanic was alone in the North Mid Atlantic.
Yeah. And there is a shot that in the movie that shows
Yeah.
how alone
Oh yeah,
the ship is. And it's very jarring to look at.
Eerily stark.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's when one of the rockets goes off and you see the bow starting to submerge into the water, and it's like dark.
Yeah.
There's no other light around them. And when they get to port, of course, newspaper reporters are already there in New York. They're already, reporting on the disaster. And in front of us, we have two different newspaper reportings of like one that says all of the passengers were saved. There again, this is like this whole mindset, like how could a British ship sink and not have anybody survive? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But then you have the other reporter that has more information come in. You get the exact totals of who survived, who did not. So information speaking, it was very slow getting the information that people needed. False hope was everywhere. And when they got the news of whether or not their family members actually survived or didn't survive, it was devastating. Devastating. But now and it took, I think, like 3 months after the sinking to try and recover everyone that had gone down
Yeah.
in the ship of Titanic. And now there's a Titanic Memorial Cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Which I would really like to visit. I haven't visited yet, but I want to.
Another question for you guys.
Yes.
All right. So Bill Paxton, right?
Yeah.
Spends his entire career
Uh-huh.
looking for this diamond.
Uh-huh.
His whole career.
Yep.
This woman that's on the ship, she has it with her the whole time.
Yep.
Then at the end of the movie, tosses it
Yeah.
over into the ocean.
Yeah.
How selfish is she on a scale of 1 to 10?
Not at all.
I beg to differ.
I'm going to call that a baller move.
Not at all. She was letting go of the past. She was saying
Yeah.
goodbye.
And I think it was more selfish that he was looking for it in
Yeah.
the first place. It's
Yeah,
a grave site. He
Right.
shouldn't have been.
But he's looking for it for historical purposes.
No, he's not.
I
How
don't
do you
think
know?
that's what he said.
That's not what he said.
What do you say?
He's a treasure hunter, is what he is.
Yeah, and
He wanted
I'm
to get
sure
paid.
that diamond would end up in a museum, though.
I don't think so.
Where's it gonna? Who's gonna buy that diamond? You know what I mean?
A very interested collector would buy it for sure. Now like Titan like so after World War I, Titanic was forgotten. It was no longer within the collective memory of anybody who was there, who survived. It because of course it was overshadowed by World War I and that whole atrocity and mess. And it's not until 1985 when we have Robert Ballard, who is working for the Navy, who's trying to find these nuclear submarines that had gone down, and the Navy couldn't find them anymore, and he accidentally finds Titanic.
Oh, I thought it was interesting. I just read his autobiography,
Oh, really?
and it was more like he was looking for the nuclear submarines, but it was a deal he had with the Navy that if he looked for them and he found them, then he could use the remaining time to go look for the Titanic.
Oh, but he found the Titanic first.
No, after.
After.
Yeah.
Okay. But I saw an interview with him at the University of Rhode Island. He said that he never found the submarines.
Really? Mm-hmm. I feel like he talked about it being like a secret.
Yeah, it was.
People weren't supposed to know what he was doing with the Navy, so
That's-
that could be why.
yeah.
There's conflicting reports of.
Yeah. Well, that's true too, because he spoke that he was supposed to find these Navy ships, these Navy submarines, but because of the Cold War, we're talking 1985. The Cold War is still going on with the Soviet Union at the time. The Navy didn't want anybody to know that they had lost to these nuclear submarines somewhere in the North Atlantic. So his cover was that he was looking for the Titanic, and he ended up finding the Titanic first and not being able to find the nuclear submarines until much later. He found one of them. He didn't find the other one. So, and then that brings up, that I think then brought Titanic back to the collective memory of people, of popular culture. And now he's trying to preserve Titanic because you have people who have like 60 grand on hand and they go diving down in these submarines to the bottom of the North Atlantic, and now they're damaging the ship. They're taking things that really should not be taken because it's a grave site. So now you have modern day grave robbers that are taking memorabilia from the ship when they really should stay with the ship.
Yeah, I saw people got married down there. Like on the bow. They got married. It's like, all right. Doesn't seem like the best setting, but, you know.
To each his own, I suppose. To each his own.
It's an ominous start to a relationship there.
Yeah. I think they just did that for the prestige of it, not because they actually had interest in the Titanic. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, it definitely seemed like it was for publicity, but I don't know, I still probably wouldn't want to go along with something like that. But
No. And like, to go back to the collective memory of people before they actually entered World War I, after the ship went down, there was so many stories that were generated by people who weren't actually part of the sinking that like created legends in Captain Smith and the musicians that had gone down with the ship whose bodies were never recovered. I mean, you had 17 immigrants from this town, from this village in Ireland, and only 7 survived, or was it 3? But the number, like it's like the number of people that didn't make it was very large, and I can't remember the exact number of it, and I wish I had remembered, but I can't. So I mean, you have all these legends that come out of the sinking within the initial years or the initial month after it happened, and then World War I comes around, and everyone forgets about it. The stories go away. And then you have conflicting memories of what happened, and so it's a wonder that we can get it all straight.
That is true.
Afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I was impressed when I was reading that they really were sure of like what time things happened, because that's not something I realized before.
Yeah.
You know, it's pretty well documented for what you would have thought.
Right. Especially because like most of the survivors didn't want to talk about what happened because of how devastating it was. And you had family members who didn't want to talk about it if they lost a family member and didn't have a body to give a proper burial to. So it's quite incredible the amount of accurate documentation we have on the ship, on who was on the ship, on, you know, the meals that were served onto the ship. You know, it's quite incredible. And the research, it's all there. So if you want to do more research on the Titanic, it's all available, very easily accessed now with the internet. So yeah, you have anything else to add?
No.
No?
I think we covered a lot.
I think we did too as well.
All right, last question.
Okay.
Did Titanic deserve, what did it win, 10 Oscars or 11? Did it deserve all of them?
What was it up against?
That's a good question. Let's look it up. Let's look it up.
I don't know. I didn't really look into its Oscar wins since I was too focused on, you know, the ship and the people that were lost on it. you know. Because the shipbuilders also, the few shipbuilders also died building the ship as well, so.
All right, let's see. The Full Monty. Oh, Goodwill Hunting Ellie Confidential.
Wow.
Hmm.
I gotta tell you, I think I like both of those movies better than Titanic. Ellie Confidential's a quality movie. Goodwill Hunting, that's, Robin
Yeah.
Williams has a beard, so you know it's good.
My God.
You know
I
it's
guess
serious.
I'm pulling for Goodwill Hunting.
Right, yeah.
These.
Yeah.
Sam.
I don't know. I would say the cinematography was very good in the movie. Like, they did a really good job at showing how large and how grand Titanic was. Costume was good. I don't know how historically accurate the costumes were, but they at least made an attempt to create costumes of the time period. James Cameron, myself, just personally, is a hit or miss for me. I like some of his stuff, and other stuff it's like, why did it take you this long to make the movie? Kind of a thing. So
I respect the lunacy, the like building submarines and nonsense. You
Yeah.
know, hey, he's going for it.
he is, and I appreciate his attempt at least portraying the sinking of the Titanic as historically as he possibly could make
Yeah.
it for the time. Because, quite honestly, in 1997, how much information did we actually have
Yeah,
on
I
the
think-
Titanic? As the years went on, we got more and more information and newer information as well. So
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the accuracy we have now of how the ship would have sank, we didn't have then.
right.
So
Right.
I think he did the best that he could with what he had at the time.
Absolutely.
It did win Best Cinematography. It won.
did.
Russell Carpenter won for Best Cinematography.
Well deserved.
Good job, Russ.
So I think we'll end it here. Thank you very much for joining us. Please like, subscribe, and comment below on whether or not you thought James Cameron did a good job portraying Titanic as a historical piece. Whether or not you appreciate the romance of Jack and Rose. I could take it or leave it since it's not historically accurate. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.